Welcome to Reddit Aliens. What's the spookiest or creepiest thing you've ever experienced? Posted one day ago. Please remember to like, share, and subscribe. I lived in a home in Pennsylvania that is on the National Register of Historic Places. I lived with 2 roommates. A lot of inexplicable things happened in that house. We believe there were 2 ghosts in the house. It started before we even moved in, while my roommate and I were painting the place. Whenever I was there alone, I kept feeling like someone was standing behind me. One night, while cleaning paint rollers in the kitchen sink, I clearly heard whispering in the adjacent room. The windows were open, so I attributed it to sound from outside near the street bouncing around. But in retrospect, I never would have heard whispering up on the second floor. A week later, my roommate's mom was over, and she looked around the living room and said, "Well, it's a bit of a fixer, but at least it's not haunted." On cue, the window next to her suddenly slammed shut. Window weights can break, I told myself. My roommate's mom said, "I won't be back." So, lots of weird little things had been going on for months, but we kept trying to ignore them or figured there was some logical explanation even when we knew there wasn't. The cat walking into the living room inexplicably soaking wet, missing things showing up in odd places. If you try hard enough, you can explain away anything. Many nights when I would turn off the TV before going to bed, I'd get a few steps away and it would come back on. Turn it off, get a few steps farther away, TV comes on. Turn it off, get almost out of the room, TV comes on. Turn it off again, get halfway up the stairs, TV comes back on. This only would happen to me, never to my roommates. This was a 3-story house with an office downstairs and residence above. Our space was on the 2nd and 3rd floors. Annie's bedroom was next to the stair landing on the 2nd floor, and the other 2 bedrooms were on the 3rd floor, Steve's and mine. I mentioned this geography to help you picture the night of the stairs incident. The staircase was almost a corkscrew spiral from the front door to the 3rd floor. Beautiful woodwork, but creaky. It was a Saturday night, and my roommates and I all went to bed by 11 p.m. Sometimes around 1:30, I woke up. As I lie there in the dark, I heard footsteps on the stairs down at the 2nd floor. I figured it was Steve, whose room was next to mine. The footsteps were slow, heavy, measured. That seemed weird since Steve worked in landscaping and he always left his boots downstairs by the front door so as not to track grass or mud into the house. At the top of the landing, the footsteps paused briefly, but then resumed, pacing, floor creaking. The area was really too small to be a proper hallway. It was at most 10 feet long, with a closet on the right, the door to Steve's room on the left, and my bedroom door at the end. After about a minute, I heard the person walk back to the stair, only to return back up the stairs slowly about 5 minutes later. The pacing on the landing continued, then back down the stairs. This up and down the stairs went on for hours. I was wide awake with no hope of sleeping. Whenever the walker got to the landing, there was shuffling and pacing, and a seeming hesitation, as if there was a decision to be made. At one point, I got out of bed and was about to open my bedroom door, but although I wasn't scared exactly, I couldn't bring myself to turn the knob. I very quietly got down on the floor, flat on my belly. I thought I'd try to peer through the gap between the bottom of the door and the floor, but it was dark, and even with my cheek pressing into the floorboards, I couldn't see anything on the landing. I stayed there for about 20 minutes, but the footsteps had subsided. Back to bed. I fell asleep about an hour before dawn. The next morning, I headed downstairs to the kitchen. Steve and Annie were both at the table. Coffee was finished brewing, and Annie was eating cereal. I blurted out, "Geez, Steve, were you restless last night, or what? What was with all that walking up and down the stairs?" I had never seen the color actually drain from someone's face until that moment. Steve stopped pouring coffee, gripping the pot in one hand and his mug in the other. Annie's arm froze with her cereal spoon halfway between the bowl and her mouth. They stared at me. Steve said, "I thought that was you." Annie's eyes got very large and she whispered, "Please tell me you're kidding and it was one of you." We looked at each other for a few seconds and Steve said, "If it wasn't any of us, then somebody was in our apartment for hours." Steve said he had been awake all night, sitting up in bed, knees to chest, blanket under his chin, too scared to make a sound or open his bedroom door. Annie's bedroom was at the 2nd floor landing, and she said the pacing started outside her door. She also had not slept. I said, "Oh my God, did we forget to lock the front door?" That door was the only way into our apartment. I headed out of the kitchen, got halfway down the stairs and stopped. The deadbolt was locked. The security slider chain was in place. We checked the hall closet to see if someone was hiding inside. Nothing. Both of our roommates moved out a week later. I stayed in that house for almost 7 years. Lots of other weird things continued to happen. After I moved out, the place never stayed rented for more than 3 months at a time. Eventually, the apartment was converted into offices. In high school, I agreed to sit for a friend of my grandparents while she was out of town over the weekend. Happened to be Halloween over that weekend. She had a lot of Native American art pieces and artifacts all over her house, as well as a collection of these old school oil cans. I don't know why, but I picked one up and pressed the bottom of one a few times, and it made that distinct metallic popping sound that I thought was kinda cool. The lady also had an old, deaf dog I was charged with feeding and caring for. The first night there, I stayed up late watching movies from her DVD collection, then finally went to bed after midnight. I woke up startled and heard noises coming from the living area. It sounded like a bunch of different oil cans making that popping noise. The dog was up and standing facing the closed bedroom door. I got a rush of chills and a knot in my stomach, but stayed put till morning. The next day was Halloween, and I asked my best friend if she could come stay the night with me, which she agreed to. I told her what happened, and she thought it was odd, but was also incredulous. We watched a movie and eventually went to bed. Woke up around the same time in the middle of the night to the sound and the dog doing the same thing. And then I looked over at my friend, thinking I should wake her up, but right as I thought that, she sat up, got out of bed without acknowledging me, and went to the bathroom attached to the bedroom and brushed her teeth. She returned to bed without saying a word to me and laid back down to go to sleep. In all the sleepovers we'd ever had, which were quite a few, I'd never seen her sleepwalk before. Once again, I was too scared to do anything and stayed in bed paralyzed with fear until I eventually fell asleep. The next morning, after we'd both woken up, I asked her if she remembered waking up to brush her teeth, and she said no, but was creeped out by it because she'd never sleepwalked before to her knowledge. Then we went out to the living room and saw that the furniture in the living room had been shifted a bit. The fluffy carpeting showed the indents of where the furniture legs had been previously, about 2 inches away. Thankfully, that was my last night having to watch the house, and I still don't know what to make of it, but I made sure to always have an excuse whenever the lady asked if I wanted to house sit again, and eventually she stopped asking. Supernatural or easily explained? What do you think? A few years ago, my family went to my sister's friend's birthday party. When we went to drive home, it was nighttime. We were driving home, and my parents noticed some glowing eyes and immediately slowed down. We live in Wisconsin, so we assumed it was a deer as usual. However, when my parents looked closer, they noticed it was a cow. A cow had been just standing in the middle of the road. We were waiting for it to move, and then my parents noticed more shadows. There were more cows behind that cow, and they were walking over toward our car. We backed up into a nearby driveway. We thought we were safe, but the cows followed our car. Before we knew it, an entire herd of cows was marching along toward the driveway. We watched as we were trapped in a driveway with an entire herd of cows cornering us. The cows eventually surrounded our car, and at that point, we couldn't move at all. My parents had called the police to get the cow situation in control by this point. We waited and waited, getting more concerned about how the cows were coming right up to the car and pushing it. I could hear the cows through the vents in the car. My parents kept frantically calling the police, urging them to come, and they kept saying they were on their way. Eventually, the cows moved from the driveway and back into the road. We were trying to figure out what to do next, because we figured the cows would see the headlights and come right back to trap us. We thought of turning off our headlights so that the cows wouldn't be drawn toward us. We believed that the cows were following our headlights. The cop finally drove by and kept driving. He drove right past us, and we were confused and concerned that he just kept going. We figured that he missed where we were and was going off into the darkness, never to be seen again. Later, the cop drove by again and stops. He said that he couldn't find the cows. We were confused as they had just been on the road earlier. We ended up driving home, never seeing the cows again. It's almost as if the cows never existed. They probably walked off the road, but it was still strange. Oh, I just remembered another one. One evening, I went to go get groceries, and after I'd pulled up to our apartment building, I was about to text my husband to ask if he could come help me bring groceries in, but right as I sent the text, he called me. I answered and was about to ask him if he could come help, but he interrupted me and mumbled something that sounded like, "No roads home." It was definitely his voice, and then hung up. I was so confused. He came out shortly after that, and I asked what he'd said earlier on the phone, and he looked at me like I asked why he had clothes on outside. He said he didn't call me, and I said, "Yes, you did," and pulled up my phone to show him my call log. His name was there and everything. At this point, I thought he was playing a prank on me. He then pulled out his phone to show me his call log and didn't show any outgoing calls by him within a reasonable time frame. I really questioned my sanity and was thoroughly creeped out because I know what my husband's voice sounds like, and it was totally his voice. But to this day, he insists he never called me. Years ago, something knocked 3 times on my bathroom door and nobody else was home. I was in the shower, and I always felt the need to shut and lock the door when I showered in that house. Had a feeling of being cornered in that bathroom. The weird thing is that it was a brand new house. I thought maybe it was my significant other playing a prank, thought it was way too early for him to be home from work. I jumped out and quickly got dressed, but he wasn't home. Sat on the driveway until he got back. Also, in the same house, woke up in the middle of the night one time to my dog standing over me in the bed and staring out into the living room growling. This was a goofy, happy dog who never met a stranger. Not a watchdog at all. And the fact that he didn't get off the bed or go check it out was creepy as hell. He eventually laid back down but seemed on edge. Needless to say, I stayed in bed and didn't face the doorway. I was in a Target a few years ago, getting some bedding for my apartment. I was 20 at the time, and for the sake of the story, I'm a woman. Anyways, I kept running into this guy in every aisle, like too many times for it to be a coincidence. By about the 7th time I ran into him, he made a comment about how it was nice to see me again. I kinda laughed it off and went back to overthinking what bed sheets I wanted before moving one aisle over to overthink the comforters instead. Dude pops up again and looks at me and said I was pretty, and before I could say anything in response, followed that up by asking how old I was. I responded I was 20, more so out of surprise than wanting to actually answer honestly. The guy stared at me for a few seconds, then turned on his heel and left the aisle. Didn't see him the entire rest of the time I was in the store. Not sure entirely if it's creepy, but definitely makes me uneasy looking back on it. Homer sounds like a decent guy to me. What do you think? There is a ghost at my brother-in-law's parents' old house in Mississippi that singles me out for special treatments every time I stay there. Turns out, the bathroom light on me almost every time. The switch is at the entrance and it's a long, narrow, dark bathroom, so it really pisses me off. Climbs into bed with me most nights, but sits on the right corner of the bed, and I feel stares at me. Loves to turn on the TV, glaringly loud at 3 a.m. some nights. Holds the door shut so I can't get into the bathroom. This has been going on now for 30 years, ever since my first visit, and the family introduced me to Homer the ghost. I laughed and made a lot of jokes about Homer that evening. That night, Homer introduced himself to me all night long. I'm not afraid of him anymore. He doesn't hurt me, just likes to F with me a lot. I've noticed that if I'm not feeling well, he pretty much leaves me alone, so he's okay. I was in my living room finishing up an MOC I was building, and I had a figure facing down, and I was putting the last piece before I started to put figures in. The figure facing down suddenly began to lift up by itself, and I'm still not sure if it was my imagination or it actually happened. Later that night, around 2 a.m., I woke up to go to the restroom, and the light downstairs were on, and I live alone, and I was damn sure I had turned them off. I was young, maybe 10 or so, and there was an empty house across the road that my 2 younger brothers and I would play at, just building cubbies in the yard and whatnot. One day, a guy from across the road wanted to play too. He was a lot older, maybe 18 or so, and he was friends with my older brothers, so it wasn't too weird to us at the time. We were in the backyard with fences all around. His game he wanted to play was Dizzy Wizzies. Basically, he'd grab our hands, spin until our feet left the ground, and continue to spin until we were dizzy. Let us down and on to the next kid. After a little, he decided after a Dizzy Wizzy, we had to run around the house and back to him for another. Eventually, this meant that there was only one kid at a time with him. He sent my brother off as I got back and he spun me. After a little, I yelled stop because I was pretty dizzy. He did, and I had my eyes closed as he hugged me close, moving a little bit. My other brother caught up and I did my lap. Again, it was my turn, same thing, told hi. To stop, and he hugged me close again, but this time I realized he was moving me up and down, which was a bit weird. Third time round, the hugging and moving finally clicked. This guy was rubbing my body against himself up and down over and over, effectively humping my 10-year-old body. He never said a word, sometimes grunting, but nothing past that. After he let me go that time, I left. I asked my brothers later, and he didn't do that same to them, just me. I'm their sister. I never told anyone, but a few weeks later, my dad was near our back fence and heard him in the yard of another young girl I used to play with, and he was talking to her about it. I don't know if he was doing it to her, but I have a feeling if that was the topic of conversation, they were doing something similar, and she knew exactly what it was. It's been 20 years since, and I still can't forget his name. I know it's not as bad as some people's experiences, but to my 10-year-old self, I couldn't figure out what I did wrong and couldn't be alone with the guy since, even now. He never touched me again, but I worry he never stopped after that, and that I was probably one of the first, so how many others did he touch after? My house was built in 1905 and was previously a small hospital. We've had lots of creepy things happen, some that stand out. Our downstairs radio will randomly turn on in the middle of the night, blaring music. Our kids have a toy magnet on the fridge that sings the ABCs. One night while fixing supper, it kept playing by itself. So I switched it completely off, thinking it was the batteries. I took 2 steps across the kitchen and it went off again. When my kids were little, they would stare at the corners of the ceiling like something was there. They would even smile and laugh while staring. And the creepiest one was right before we moved in, my dad was helping us install our washer and dryer. He had my nephew, who was 3 at the time, with him. My nephew had to use the bathroom, so I took him. While in the bathroom, he kept looking at the ceiling. I asked him what he was doing, and he said he was listening to the kids upstairs playing. He then asked if he could go play with them. The only thing upstairs was the empty master bedroom and bathroom. I told him there were no kids upstairs. He got really angry and said he could hear them. Why couldn't he play with them? I had to take him upstairs to prove there wasn't anyone there. He shrugged his shoulders and said that's weird because I can still hear them. He still remembers this and hearing the kids upstairs. Night terrors. Woke up one time lying on my side and I felt like something was behind me. For some reason, I felt this thing was just a black head with no face, and it also felt like it was an old woman. If I tried to close my eyes and drift off, the closer I got to drifting off, I could hear a buzzing in my head get louder, just before I felt this presence actually punch me in the side. I couldn't drift off because I thought I would be punched again, so I turned around really quickly to punch in that direction, but it was gone. Had another night terror when I woke up and couldn't move, and making horrifying low-pitched screams for like 10 seconds straight. Another night terror, woke up and couldn't move, and also felt like I wasn't breathing. So I said, right, this is it. I'm going to die. So I just accepted my fate until I shot up after I could move again. Night terrors are shitty. Have you ever been a part of a spiritual seance or ritual? My downstairs neighbor died a few months ago. He was actually in the process of dying inside his home for several weeks. He did not want to enter into hospice, and he was morbidly obese, being confined to a hospital bed. For about a week, you could smell death on the bottom floor where he resided. Again, he was in the process of dying. After he passed away, there was a period of about 2 weeks to 3 weeks where really weird things were happening in my apartment and the building itself. I heard people talking in my kitchen outside of my bedroom late at night. Every time I would walk into the kitchen, the voices would stop. I went on vacation, and his ex-wife and children stayed in my apartment. They also verified that they heard these things. I ended up performing a ritual with the advice of my friend who is deeply involved in spiritual practices. After I did this ritual inside my apartment and the downstairs apartment, all of this stuff stopped. The creepiest part of the whole experience was I never felt alone in my own apartment. I always felt like I was being watched. I can't quite explain what I felt the night my aunt died, about 10 years ago now, which was also my anniversary at the time. But before I even knew something was up, I had really warm, eerie feelings. My wife and I were walking on a beach hand in hand in the starlight, laughing and joking like we did in college. It was a great night in all the ways that matter before that as well. Then, when we got back to the hotel, we had like 13 messages on the cell, of course with the bad news. What was weird was during our time at the beach, we both recall a lightness and joy. Observer? I don't know. My aunt was always super positive and spiritual. I feel like maybe she said goodbye, or maybe I somehow sensed something was up with fam. Forever, it will be in my mind, a night paired with laughter and love, tempered with loss. I miss her. My wife and I both do. Perhaps it was just wishful thinking. I am kind of skeptical at heart with it and an open mind.